Yeah.
So thanks guys for coming along to the breakfast. My name's Chris Perkins. I've been asked to come and chat today about the junior athlete, and I believe there's about 30 or so coaches here. So I want to make it relatively interactive. I've got a bed here so we can actually jump up and do some of the things that maybe you'd like to look at with some of the kids or athletes that you sort of coach. My background is probably being a physio in the world of sports physio for probably 16 years now. I've worked with many different sporting teams over time, and I guess track and field has been a big part of that. Okay, I've been involved probably as a consultant, I suppose, with track and field. I don't have one particular physio at Waste, but I've sort of worked along with other people with track and field for many years, and pole vaulters and a few of Lynn's athletes over the last few years, and see a few coaches, Lenny here as well. I've worked with some of the junior athletes. So it's a good mix of things I've seen. Hopefully I can share some of that experience today. And feel free to ask questions as we go through. I think it's really important that you direct the actual talk a little bit. These are things, I guess, that I had in my head on what you would want out of it. And if we haven't got this at the end of the session, you need to ask me. So, is this the sport that the athlete should be doing? How much training is too much? What are the injuries we're dealing with? How do we prevent them? Is weight training in the junior athlete relevant? Is it important? All these questions are sort of things that go through your mind as coaches. So we know in the junior athletes, particularly, there's a big variation, a huge variation in many things, and physical conditioning and strength is a big part of that, and the big variations will lead to the difference in what you see in the kids' talent as well. So quite often these physical coordination abilities go hand in hand with the kids' performance. So as coaches, your aim is to help them perform to the best of their ability, but at the same time there's going to be limitations because of their genetics and because of their growth and personality, which leads to commitment sometimes. So we know that we go through stages as athletes, as children, and the growth starts at about the age 10 generally. The girls are going a little bit quicker than the boys. The boys take a while to catch up based on the numbers there, and I suppose that can sometimes relate to when the girls will get injuries a little bit more earlier than the guys. So these huge rapid growth phases, girls sort of 10 to 13, boys a bit later, are the times when they start to lose that coordination, or the flexibility issues arise, or their motor control issues arise. And they're things as a physio I see really important to identify and then manage from a coaching point of view with the most appropriate sort of plan. I suppose just a little bit of info about the growing body. The cartilage that we have in kids is a bit thicker, so they're actually the ends of the bones, okay, the ends of the bones, a little bit thicker, so actually less vulnerable to nasty joint injuries that we get as adults. We sort of fall and land on our knee and wear and tear our joints, and we get holes that come in the cartilage in between our bones. They don't repair so well once we're adults. As a junior, they've got a lot more ability to repair quicker, and I suppose from that point of view, they can take a lot of stress and strain, the kids as well. But what we quite often see also is that weaker points in the bone. With tendons, so hands up, what's the most common tendon you'd probably see injuries with in the kids or adults? Patella tendon, yep. So patella tendon, Achilles tendon are probably the most common injuries we see. As adults, we sort of tend to get those tendon injuries. As kids, because they've got these weaker attachment of their bone at that place called the apophysis, they tend to create bony traction injuries as opposed to the ligament or the tendon. Okay, so where that tendon attaches onto the bone, has anyone heard of Osgood Slatters before? Everyone probably has. Okay, the kids with the lumpy parts on their knee. That's because the muscle or the tendon has been tractioning away at that bone as opposed to the tendon being the weakest point. The bone is the attachment is the weakest point there, and that's where they're vulnerable to injury. So an example of bone when we're talking about bony growth is here on your right, the development of the growth plate. Okay, that black line in the middle there gives us room to move when we're growing. Okay, that's where we talk about growing pains, and I think that's a sort of fallacy that we can sort of get rid of in a way, because growing pains is really not a true diagnosis in my in my book or any research really that exists around it, but it's a nice term we can give to pain we're not sure what's going on with. But the growth plate allows for the expansion of bone, called the epiphysis at the end of the bones and the metaphysis in the middle, okay? Not the technology you need to know all that much, but just for peace of mind if you hear people talking about it. So the bones are more resilient in the child, so when anyone had a kid or an athlete that's actually fallen and landed, they bend their bones as opposed to break them. Okay, so that's sort of a green stick fracture. It just tells us about the difference between kids and adults. They're sort of a little bit more resilient with that. So there's a couple of examples of bendy bone as opposed to a direct crack. And I suppose an example of an avulsion fracture on the left there. On the edge of the pelvis, anyone know what that muscle might be on the actual front edge of the pelvis there? ASIS. Okay, the sartorius muscle is a common one in beach sprinters and sprinters. Comes all the way along our leg there. It's a common one to pull off as well. So we can talk about the management of those things soon. So as I said, the cartilage or bone injury generally becomes a complete injury because of the actual tendon attachment. Less likely to have ligament sprains when kids go over because they're actually more likely to, as I said there, pull off that end of the bone as opposed to the actual ligament. It doesn't mean they can't sprain the ligament. It can still occur, but the weaker parts are the bony attachments. And I guess the big thing I see a lot at the moment is when they grow, and you see this yourself, their flexibility becomes a big issue, particularly in the hamstrings. The bones grow really sort of quite quickly, and the muscles just don't have the capacity to keep up or stretch in conjunction with the growth of the bones.
On that, when the bones grow, do the muscles, how much do you get lineal growth in muscles, or is it stretching of the...
Well, of course you get development of the muscles as well, but it's the stretching and lengthening along with the bone. So it's just not in coordination. To give you an exact answer on that, it's hard to give a graph on how quickly the muscles catch up. Everything's growing, the cells are growing all the time. We get bigger glutes, we get bigger quads, but the stretch of that, the muscles are under more stretch because the bones are growing quicker. So they can't keep up, they still develop. Because of that, you'll see that commonly where the kids just can't touch the ground, and all of a sudden a year before they could. So their sit and reach test becomes very poor. And because of that, their ability to squat really nicely and move with good movement control is very impaired. And that's where we need to understand what we can do as coaches to adjust that, or who to send them to sort of look at managing that well. So I guess the degree of injury we see with athletes comes with physical activity. Okay, the higher level athlete, and I deal with sort of these guys at the highest that they can go, and they're training every day doing something, they're of course more at risk with injury, a lot more at risk because they're doing more and they're training at high intensity. But those people who are doing nothing with activity physically, sedentary, are also at risk. So you get this sort of balancing act where you're high risk doing nothing, medium risk doing sort of moderate exercise, high risk again when you're doing too much. And that comes back down to, from a coaching point of view, training load and how much you put into them and what's the right amount. And this is a difficult sort of question to answer, but it's hopefully give you a few strategies today to understand how you can identify when too much training is occurring. So, funnily enough, there's some stats saying girls tend to report injuries more than the boys, and the incidence of sports injuries tends to rise as they get past that sort of pubescent stage as well. Maybe that's because they're doing a lot more then as well. So we see types of injuries. We've got traumatic injuries and we've got sort of overuse injuries, and you can explain that in two different ways. Traumatic injuries generally are pretty simple ones. They're from an incident or going too hard or exploding, changing direction, and tissue stress has occurred. The overuse ones are the ones that we probably need to understand a bit more, and then they can be identified through looking at your training loads, looking at your biomechanics, looking at the flexibility issues, strength issues, all those things that will give you an idea of today you can look for. Common injuries we see, if we're talking about track and field, running in particular, more the lower limb of course. You've got the many injuries in the pelvis. Probably the most common ones you'll see are the Achilles tendon being Sever's disease, or Achilles tendon itself, calf strains. You'll see patella femoral problems where it's the kneecap not tracking really well on the actual femur underneath. And you'll also see attachment injuries of the tendon, both from the patellar tendon, where you actually get a Osgood-Schlatter's type tractioning force on the bone, or you get this is a nice one to remember, Sinding-Larsen-Johansson, if you remember that one, where the actual bony attachment at the top of the tendon is tractioning at the patella. So at the end of the day, there's many injuries you'll see, but what I'll try and present today is what to look for and how actually train your athlete to become more resilient. Okay, what movements can you do? Other injuries occur from a muscle point of view, so these are attachment injuries. The sartorius here, as I said, a sprinting muscle. The sartorius' job is to bring your leg up and through in a powerful way in a high knee drive, and that can actually traction with overuse and pull off the actual attachment of the bone at the top of the pelvis. The hamstring attachment, so sprinters quite often will get this, in particular with explosion activity, where you actually will traction that bone off the hamstring attachment. Sometimes it's hard to identify that compared to a hamstring strain. But just to be aware of, I mean, they're all pretty heavy duty injuries. The Osgood-Schlatter's the same thing, anterior knee pain, the severs being the Achilles, little leaguers where your muscles of your forearm attached to that bony prominence there. So they're all muscles attaching onto bones and tractioning. So the Osgood-Schlatter's, your Sever's disease there. Perthes disease, again, not one to sort of exclude, but you won't see this much. Just one to remember, if your athlete has this weird sort of anterior thigh pain, knee pain in the groin, but they can still be active, but they're sort of losing their range of movement a little bit and quite quickly go down. Or as a younger kid from the ages of 4 to 10, they're not developing well. Okay, you're probably past that point with a lot of your athletes anyway, but it's a disorder that is diagnosed with loss of blood flow at the top of the femur. Okay, so just think that disease is a really important one to get managed and off to a medical review ASAP if you're thinking nasty hip pain. Again, you probably won't come across it, but it's always one to mention in discussions, because if they go missed, they can become long-term injuries for kids. But look, these are the list of injuries that we still see in all our older athletes too in track and field. The stress fractures, the overuse iliotibial friction syndrome, okay, where you've got a band of muscle down the side of your leg tractioning at the bone, creating stress and pain. Your shin pain, okay, your stress fractures, your compartment syndromes where your muscles build up too much pressure and give you pain in your front of your shin or the back in your calf. So there's different compartments in our legs, in our lower legs, that can actually build up in pressure. And a lot of it comes down to why is it there. So anterior knee pain, probably would you say that's one of the most common things you guys see? I mean, is there another injury that you guys sort of see regularly with your athletes?
Shin splints.
So yeah, the shin splints, again, the diagnosis of shin splints is a very sort of general one, so we try and isolate it to either your bony stress or your compartment pressure and patellofemoral. So the things we see with patellofemoral pain are the kids where they're squatting or lunging, or the plyometrics starting to hurt, and a lot of it comes because that kneecap isn't quite sitting right. Okay, where that kneecap should sit, okay, it angles off to the side. The angles that are created by these knees here changes the alignment of the whole sort of leg. And if you've seen any of your young athletes run where they lose that control and their knee comes forward, that's a huge one for me that predicts not just knee pain, hip pain, shin pain, Achilles problems, so all the spectrum I'm talking about. So what I'll present now is some, I suppose, some things where you can look at from a biomechanical point of view as a simple test as a coach, some flexibility testing, some strength measures, and some functional testing, which is what you do, watching them run, and how to maybe identify what you can do about it. And breaking it down from their running backwards to identify which parts of this athlete need management. So, and more than happy to email the group with this whole presentation for you, okay? So you can write down what you think is relevant, but yeah, I want to put a bit of participation. So firstly, your posture stuff, okay? this is the age where we can have an influence on our athletes. I'm always nagging the Eagles guys where I work as well about their poor posture and how that influences pain, how that influences muscle recruitment. If we sit well, our muscles switch on. Okay, if we don't sit well, they don't switch on. Okay, everyone sort of sits in their chair a bit, but everyone's sitting quite well for the start of the day. We know through studies that positioning ourselves well in standing and sitting gets the right muscles working. And I'll tell the athletes that, look, all you got to do is sit properly, and that's part of your homework, that's part of your exercise, that's your muscles switching on. And we'll go through that a little bit in a minute with a volunteer. So let's actually go through some really simple things that you can do with some of your flexibility testing. Does anyone do any screening with their athletes, with the younger groups? Yep. And sort of, what sort of stuff do you look at?
With the young ones, we started with ball check type postural assessments.
Yep.
Okay, that's probably a bit too detailed.
Yeah.
More recently, squat tests, Ray Cook.
Yep.
So it's in the doorway.
Yep.
And that's been quite telling for whether or not they're ready
Yeah.
to do any squat work or any heavy work.
Good. Because I think the key with assessing your athletes is understanding how they move. And if they can move well, you can then train them into further strength conditioning. If you've got someone who just collapses when they do a squat or is all over the place when they actually do a hop, how are you going to get them to train well, or how are you going to get them to perform if that's inefficient movement? I suppose if you can start from the beginning and work up, obviously you're going to do the training, but while you're training, you can still develop their coordination and strength and tasks with these functional movements. So functional movement screen is a really important one. But before we get to that, we actually have to identify are there other limitations. So flexibility issues. Who's going to be a volunteer? Lenny, did you say you're going to volunteer? No.
My flexibility.
John will? I'll see Lenny far away. Okay, John, let's do a simple Thomas test position, okay? It's a really good one if you've got a physio bench to identify the key muscles around your body, around your pelvis that are tight, okay? So he's going to make sure the table is supported, sitting on right on the edge of the bed. Now obviously shorts are required for this one, so John will get a assessment on what muscle length is restricted. Okay, so bring one knee up to your chest, mate, lie back flat. Like we go there. So I'd have him right on the edge of the bed ideally, okay? So I can then test whether or not this leg goes back further. Okay, so we'll hop him up. So he's looking pretty good already, right on the edge of the bed even further. Thanks, mate. Yep, and back you go now again. Knee up. Perfect, perfect.
This is my good side.
So he's in pretty good nick here. So what I see, this is testing the hip flexor muscle, the muscle that drives you forward, but also the muscle that allows you to get your hip back. Does that make sense for running? So if you are so tight in your hip flexor, what's going to happen around here? If I can't get my hip back, what am I going to do? So what I'll tell you, what happens often is you can't switch your glute on because you can't get your leg back well enough, so your glute doesn't switch on. John's having a good stretch here. And then you also will extend somewhere else. Where am I going to extend from if I can't get my hip back? So my lumbar spine will overarch. You see that a lot with your athletes, is that they can't get back here, so they have to arch their back. And all of a sudden, after 2 or 3 sessions of running, oh, my back's really sore and I need to bend forward and stretch because they don't have good hip flexor length to get back, to switch the glutes on, or they don't have good control of how to hold their position here. Or it's just a technical thing from a running coaching point of view that you need to adjust by changing where they are in space. So if we go through that one again there, John.
Do you want to do the other side?
Yeah, we'll do the other side.
The other side's really crooked.
So we'll get a comparison. Quite often you'll do this test. So again, not terrible though. He's got some hip extension. I expect anyone who can get below the bed is doing okay. I also check the flexibility of outwards from a movement point of view, comparing your adductor muscle. Okay, so swapping it over. Adductor muscle is in the inside, so if I actually take him outwards, does that make sense? I'm comparing how tight that is. More common for change of direction sports and those things though, like football players who use their adductors a lot for kicking. But the big one for track and field athletes is also your quads. So your rectus femoris, so your quad muscle that comes across 2. So that should get to about 100 degrees. and he's doing okay. Do you feel a stretch there at all? Yeah. Yep. So he'll feel a stretcher here, and you can do that on both sides and see if there's an obvious difference in resistance. And then across your body this way, that's probably the big one, the ITB. So the iliotibial band, has everyone heard of that? It's a band that comes from your TFL muscle up here, which is the belly muscle, down the side of your knee, attaching to the actual side here. It can pull your kneecap laterally. It can pull your tibia bone and rotate that. So we're looking at how tight that is compared to the other side. And in John, he's quite restricted on both sides. There's expectations of what you should see from a normal, but also you're comparing left to right. Okay, so there's a simple test, and we do that one at the Eagles guys, and I do that one with my pole vaulters once a week as a routine. It takes a minute to do, boop, 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 and you can get some good info.
Can we just go over the again? So you get them to...
So hold them there, position yourself like that, or just hold it consistently.
And then
so it's 1 for hip flexor, 2 for adductor, 3 to ITB length, 4 for quads. Okay, so they're simple tests. Again, you're very restricted, or it's different. You're identifying asymmetry. So that's that one, John. Yep. If we can come back up onto the bench for me. Okay, sit and reach. It's a good old classic. It's a measurement of flexibility in your hamstrings, your glutes, and your back. So if you're sitting up for me, one hand on top of the other, you can get a fancy sit and reach box, or you can just get a measurement with a ruler. See if they're towards their toes or away from their toes. Okay, so as far as you can go. Tell you what, he must have been an athlete, this man. So he's got, you know, if I had a tape measure, I'd measure maybe plus 3 or 4 centimetres. When you do the measurements, try and keep consistent. So his shoes on, shoes off. So if you measure it next time, it's the same. One hand top of the other. Whenever you're measuring anything, reliability is important, otherwise we're sort of not really truly measuring what we're supposed to. So the big one in that one, it determines some hamstring length and some back length, but it's not identifying the specific area, but it can be a part of your screen. So if one day your athlete comes in and all of a sudden they're a -10 and last week they were +5, you know they're sore, you know they're stiff, you know, that's a big variation. And it's a quick screen test, so it's a quick one that guys can do maybe on a Sunday or a Monday before the team starts. You all run through these little screens. And the higher level, so sporting teams are all about identification of anything that you can find to prevent injury. So you're not going to stop them running because of that, but if you've got 5 or 6 things in a little screen that tell you, oh, they're a bit stiff today and they're complaining of some tightness, should I run them? Should I actually train them fully today? Or should I not do anything but modify their training? And that's what I'm trying to get at today, is actually how you guys would identify a modification of training, so we don't just keep training and rely on the kids who don't want to tell you they're sore, okay, until they break, until they actually say, oh, I can't train now. So that's a sit and reach. Another good, reliable, valid test is a dorsiflexion lunge test. So if you come up for us, mate, and everyone should probably have a go of this, just standing up and see how far, if everyone can just stand up for us, and see how far you can get your knee over your toes. So you need a flat wall or your chair. The aim with this test is to see how far you can get your knee over your toes with your heel down, okay? And you know, to measure it, you need to measure against something. Again, if I can get my heel down, so mine's about a +8, +9, okay? If someone's here and they can't quite get there without the heel lifting, does that make sense that that's a limitation? So for an example on, if you don't have lungeability in your ankle, this is what happens. Kids will squat like this. Watch their heels. Their heels come up quite quickly as they go down to squat. Does that make sense? So they're like, and shaky, and looks uncoordinated. And that's an important thing to sort of know, because it might not be the control here that the issue with is actually lack of range of movement at their ankle. So I put blocks under their heels so they've got support under the heels and they squat down fine. So it's actually not control, it's here. So check that first, and then go and check some other things. So lungeability, dorsiflexion lunge, or a lunge knee to wall test. Okay, you can write that down as a possible measurement device. Okay, so now we'll get everyone together, but there's some three testing procedures from flexibility. There's plenty more. Yeah.
Just one quick question on the sit and reach test.
Yes.
Do they have to have a flat back to do that?
Just No,
Because they can
no,
also
no.
go further.
Of course they can. So therefore it's not a direct measure of hamstring or back or hips. It's a general measure. So you just have to get as far as you can. So it's actually not a specific measure, it's a general, but it identifies if they're down on one part of that. And then you're going to go and identify specific things by your sort of more specific medical physio testing. So other flexibility tests exist, that's just a few there. The next step is the strength measures. So if we look at squatting, if everyone can just slide their chair back, and we'll get John. We'll do this together, and then probably I'll grab you when we need you in a minute. So we're squatting off the chair, sitting right on the edge. You can face that way for us. Sitting on the edge. Down you come on the chair. So all you're going to do now is come forward in your body. Now this is where it is different, because I like to maintain lordosis here with this, because his quad power is a lot different if you slump for me, a lot different if you slump like that and come forward, compared to keeping your lordosis there, which is an important part of training. So come forward and just off the chair, try and keep your knees at 90 degrees. So you just come off the chair. This is to try and keep it reliable and reproducible. So you try and get the same point. Because if I test John like this now, and I test him next week like that, he's going to test like for a longer hold time. Does that make sense? So keep it consistent. So come on the edge, up you come, hold. Okay, so everyone have a go and we'll just time you, okay? Sit down for a second, give you a break. All right, we'll get my stopwatch. This is what I do with the guys. Stopwatch, okay, let's go. Hold. Okay, so I'll go around and look at techniques. We'll look at, okay, who's forward, who's too far off the chair and cheating. Okay, what position your spine's at. Are your knees rolling in too far? You know, like that. Which so 18 seconds, and people with knee pain will make them give way, okay? So again, we don't want to create patellofemoral pain here, but that's where, and this is an example of hold time, and Lynn's going to go for it. Okay, so with our rowers, we've done some predictive study with our back pain and rowing, and quad strength is a massive predictor of back pain. If you're low on quad strength, you're going to have a higher risk of back pain with rowing. Okay, and there's leg strength is important for running, for track and field, or landing. So hopping up, everyone, or sitting down, sorry, 50 seconds. So, you know, ideally our rowers, we want to get them, the younger rowers, to, you know, 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes of a squat hold. And because you don't do that generally, then you wouldn't expect to be good at it. All right, another really good movement pattern is to understand, this can be a strength test, how you move from sitting to standing. How you do that predicts the way you squat. So John looks like he's got a pretty good lordosis. If I ask him just to go from sit to stand, yeah, good, and back down, that's a really simple movement. And some people can't do that well. That's where you can teach the squat on how to move your pelvis through here, tilting back and forth, or how to actually move forward without slumping. So he does it really well. But you see an athlete or an individual who can't do that, that's just basic movement control. So sit to stand on one leg. If you face everyone, this is another challenging one if you look like they're moving okay. Put one leg in front. Yep, and everyone can do this as well. Slide your chair back. Okay, you're going to put most of your weight on your back leg here. So if you come forward and up,